already talked about that tactile, auditory, chemical perception stuff. We also have something else that's really neat and develops very quickly, and this is the ability to orient towards significant stimuli. Our ability to orient towards sounds, so you hear a sound and you turn to face it, we're able to do that because we have two ears, one on either side, and sound will arrive at each of them in a slightly different way. So the side that's closer to the sound arrives faster, and it would be slightly louder than the opposite side. So that tells us where to turn our attention. We're able to do this very, very quickly after birth. But it ends up being one of those abilities that we have that instead of showing a natural progression or a continuous progression, this is one of those U-shaped functions where we have the ability to orient towards auditory stimuli early on, and then it goes away, and then it comes back later on in life. We can also have them, like I said, so chemical stimuli, so they'll react to things that are, say, sour or sweet, and that also ties into some of their reflexive behaviors. Things like some of their grasping or suckling behaviors would tie into this. So they are a lot more likely to suckle if there's something sweet around. That tactile component as well is if you, say, brush an infant's face, they tend to face towards it with that assumption that they would then start to suckle. So they're sort of predisposed to end up eating very easily. So they have a lot of reflexes that allow that to occur. And then, of course, once they stop relying on breastfeeding for most of their food, a lot of those behaviors will ease back and stop being as prominent. We've already mentioned habituation, where if you show them the same thing over and over again, they get used to it and they stop attending to it. We also see that with auditory stimuli, where if you are playing the same sound over and over again, they stop paying attention to it, they stop reacting to it. We've also mentioned that with babies and their babbling, they're able to produce all of the different phonemes for human languages, but they're also able to perceive all of those different phonemes as well. So if you habituate them to one particular sound and then play a slightly different sound, you'll see that they'll react differently if they can perceive that difference. And so very early on, they react differently to all of our different phonemes, whereas as they start specializing, as they start attending to the specific language that they're surrounded with, or languages, we see that they stop attending to those other sounds. We can also see classically conditioned responses, as well as, not listed here, operant conditioning responses as well. So there are some older studies that look at things like, it's a weird paradigm, but you set up a crib and you have a ribbon that ties an infant's foot to a mobile. And when the infant kicks, then it spins above them. And what you would then do is every time they kick, they get this visual stimulation, something moves, it's exciting, and it's new. So that's something that's then positively reinforced, which means that they will kick more often to have more visual stimulation. So we can show that, yes, they can learn, and they can show these operant conditioning behaviors even from a few weeks old, but other factors can be integrated into that learning process, which is a lot more complexity than a lot of people thought infants were capable of at the time. We can also see some simple observational learning, and this is mainly when we look at infants imitating their parents or other adults around them. So again, from a very young age, within the first few days, they're going to copy facial expressions. So it's one of those reasons adults are prone to making very exaggerated facial expressions, because it allows the infants to see them a little bit more clearly, and once they recognize those expressions, they can then copy them. So it's sometimes pointed to as evidence for some innate aspect of emotions, specifically the facial expressions tied to those emotions, but it also shows the ability to see and recognize and copy those different expressions as well. But yeah, there's a lot of different things that we can do fairly young that give us some understanding of just how complicated some of our behaviors can be, even very soon after birth. And then this slide, this is something I had referred to earlier on, talking about that flexibility in development very early in life. So this is looking at our visual acuity. So like I said, starting at birth where we have that 2800 vision. And then by those 6 months of age, we're getting pretty close to that 2100, and so on and so forth. So here we see with our red line, this would be an infant who had limited vision at birth. So I believe this is from children who had cataracts when they were born. So their eyes were functional but not receiving light. And at that 6-month point, they had reached an age where they could undergo the surgery to remove the obstructions. And from that point forward, their vision ended up improving. And so we see that by, do some math here, so yeah, so this would be about 4 years of age, they end up having sort of typical vision that matches what an adult would be capable of. But even if we look at, say, 2 years of age is another one here, they're getting very close to adult levels of vision. So we see very, very quick increases early on in life, so by that 6 months mark, and then a gradual progression until at 4, we're at adult levels. So specific sensory stuff, we already talked about that sound localization, we already talked about phoneme discrimination. The last one that I wanted to get into is music perception. And this seems like a weird concept to talk about, but when we look at things that are fairly typical of humans, this sort of draw towards certain types of sounds and away from other types of sounds seems to be pretty universal. So we look at consonant and dissonant sounds. So if you think of different chords, different pieces of music that sound pleasant or happy, that make you feel warm and fuzzy, those are typically consonant sounds. And they're usually going to have harmonics that work together really nicely. Whereas dissonant sounds are the ones that make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. So you can think of, say, the soundtrack to a horror movie, something that puts you a little bit on edge. So typically they're going to be different frequencies that clash a little bit. And that discomfort is something that's shared across cultures. It's also something that appears very, very early on, where infants will show a preference for consonant sounds and a dislike of those dissonant sounds. But our next little section, we get into the cognitive aspects here. And with cognitive development, we have one of those famous psychological figures, which is Jean Piaget. Piaget is one of our major sources for a lot of the, at least early, developmental research in psychology. I always want to give a little bit of a precaution when we start, because Piaget, while he had lots and lots of different proposals and his research has been really helpful, his research was all based on studying his own children. So some of these theories we're actually going to find, he had certain ideas that we'd see certain progressions and certain stages, but they aren't necessarily what we actually observe nowadays. And so some of that might just be his small sample size, but also we'll find some of it's actually because the methods that we're using to try and measure these things may have changed as well. So things like object permanence. I think I mentioned when we talked about how we test that, they thought that object permanence didn't come about until much later, but nowadays we've used different methods that actually allow us to see that children have object permanence months before what they originally thought. So stuff like that is fairly common, especially as we develop new testing techniques. If we get into what Piaget's theories are all about, this is going to be one of the first of our stage theories. There's a lot of stages when we talk about development. So a lot of boxes saying that you will progress through all of these components, and then you will advance from this stage to the next stage, which has another set of different criteria that you would need to meet in order to advance to the one after that. I typically have students notice the fact that within these stages, the criteria sometimes don't necessarily work out the way that we'd hoped. So you might have a child that hasn't ticked all the boxes from an earlier stage, but has started ticking boxes in a later stage, and that's a very common criticism when it comes to these different stage theories. So with Piaget, his theory overall, we could call it constructivist and dialectical, meaning that, especially with the construction side of things, that children are starting and sort of building up their understanding of the world around them. So they are constructing their own knowledge, and specifically that is an active process. So children would start out not quite knowing how things work, but through experience, and we'll see eventually experimentation, they start to learn the rules of the world around them, and they can make changes as time goes on. So a lot of this growth that we'll see, the changes that they make to their understanding, typically occur when children encounter conflicting information. Basically, they encounter something that they think should work one way, or they think that this is that category, but they learn conflicting information, something different from what they expected, and they have to adjust their understanding to include that new information. So sometimes we'll find that they just add new things. So I've encountered something I've never seen before, but I can put it over here with these concepts. Or sometimes they have to form completely new concepts to account for what it is they're encountering. And that sort of, do we add it to things or do we make our own new concepts, actually ties into these definitions for assimilation and accommodation. And then we'll talk about equilibrium because that actually relates to the other two. But starting with assimilation and accommodation, assimilation is what happens when we are adding new information to similar existing cognitive structures. So a lot of this we talk about in terms of category formation. So assimilation would be that maybe you're at the zoo and a child sees a lion and it has the right body shape to be a cat. So when you tell them that that's a cat, they put that in the category of cats. Things that have 4 legs, usually long tails, ears on the top, snouts at the front. So that case, they didn't have to change too much. They just added to an existing concept. So they've assimilated that new information. In contrast, accommodation is what happens when we have to create some new cognitive structure to account for that new information. So our new information doesn't match or doesn't easily fit into our existing concepts and cognitive structures, so we need to make something new. So if you think something is a cat, so I guess stick with our zoo example, maybe you see a hyena, and it's not quite a cat and it's not quite a dog, so you would label it as some other category of creatures. So you can't assimilate it into your existing categories, you might have to make its own category somewhere separately. And when we're talking about adding to our knowledge, adding to our understanding and how we sort stuff cognitively, we can talk about equilibrium and disequilibrium. So equilibrium is when we have agreement between what a child sees in the world and the reality that exists in their mind. So if they have a base understanding that this is how something works, then they are within equilibrium if their understanding matches what they're observing out in the world. So if they have a concept of gravity and they know that when you drop something, it hits the floor, then them dropping something off the edge of their high chair would be in equilibrium because it would hit the floor as expected. But if we see something else, so maybe you hand a child a balloon and it's full of helium, and instead of dropping to the floor as they might have predicted, it now floats to the ceiling instead. So in that case, the child would be in disequilibrium. So this is when what exists in their minds doesn't match what exists out in the real world. So they expected one thing would happen and something else happened instead. And so in these scenarios where their existing structures, their existing frameworks aren't matching what they encounter, that's when we're going to have to see things like assimilation or accommodation. So we would have maybe a new rule created for balloons to not behave that way. All right, and so as promised, Piaget's stage theory is what we're covering next. And so we have 4 major stages here. And each of these can technically be broken down even further. I think we only break down 1 or 2 of them, which will come up a little bit later on. But for our broad categories here, Piaget focuses on our sensory motor stage, our pre-operational stage, our concrete operational stage, and then our formal operational stage. And eventually, when we get towards the end of the chapter, there's actually a section where they introduce a 5th potential stage that's specific for adulthood, where we get into far more abstract thinking abilities. But we'll swing back to that when we get there. We're sticking with childhood for the first bit. But with each of these, so the sensory motor is usually before 2 years of age, pre-operational up to 7, concrete up to 11, and then formal up to 12. For our identifiers for each of these stages, the sensory motor stage, we're using our sensory abilities and our motor abilities to interact with our environment. So what are you seeing, feeling, hearing, all of those things, and how does that relate to your physical interactions with that environment? We'll see things like, this would be when children say throw everything off the edge of their high chair just to see what happens. That falls under this category. But with the pre-operational, this is where they're still going to struggle with abstract thinking for quite a while, but they can form mental representations of the past. But they also have some issues with egocentrism. But this is when children and later teens end up being very focused on themselves. And often, at least early on, it's because they don't necessarily understand or realize that other people can have feelings or knowledge that they themselves don't. So for them, their entire world is centered around their own experiences. We'll see that one of our cutoffs for moving between our pre-operational and concrete operational stages is actually a series of tasks called conservation tasks. And when you're in pre-operational, you don't grasp the concepts that are needed in order to pass that task. But once you've managed that, you can move on into the concrete operational section. And I'll hop back to that again in a few slides. We're still in summary mode. But for concrete operational, this is when we start getting the ability to reason. We start seeing a little bit of logic where they can work through what should happen under certain conditions. But once again, we have some issues with abstract thinking. So if it's something that they've encountered or something that makes logical sense based on their regular interactions with the world, then they could think about things in terms of this should happen or this could happen. But as soon as we ask them to think about things that have never occurred or that are unlikely to occur, they start struggling. And there may be a slide for this later, but one of the tasks that always sticks out for me is that for a child in the concrete operational stage, if you get them to do, the task is if you say you're going to give somebody an extra thumb. So you're going to have somebody who has 2 thumbs and 4 fingers on one hand, where would you put the thumb? And for concrete operational children, they would think that that's an absurd question. That's not something that can happen, so I wouldn't have an answer to that. Whereas once they get into the formal operational stage, they have a bunch of different answers that have logical explanations. So some children would say, oh, I'll put it right below the one that I already have, and therefore I get twice the strength on that side. Or I'd like to put it on the opposite side, so now I can grasp things from both ends, so it gives me more flexibility. So that abstract reasoning is one of our critical defining factors between those last 2 stages here. And so that abstract reasoning and talking about hypothetical situations, that's the part that makes our formal operational stage special and separate. So with the summaries out of the way, we can actually break these down a little bit more, starting with that sensory motor stage. And I think this is one of the ones where we'll start breaking it into sub-stages. But as we said, up to 2 years of age, and this is all about your sensory experiences and your motor interactions with the physical world. So you encounter things in your environment. It can also be, you can encounter your own body within the environment. So things like thumb sucking are you interacting with yourself instead of other objects. And during this stage, we can tie it back to our discussion of language, where you are in that language acquisition stage here. And so we've already mentioned the concept of object permanence, specifically looking at that board flipping task. And this image here actually shows that when something is covered for a child that's young enough, they stop paying attention, they don't remember that the thing is there. And then when you reveal it, it's suddenly back into existence. But yeah, I don't know that we even gave a proper definition to object permanence, but this is just saying that objects continue to exist even when you can't see them. And this is seen at about 8 months of age, though once again, it depends on which methods you use to try and detect object permanence or in these cases. And so, like I said, we can break down this sensory motor stage into a bunch of sub-stages. So here we've specified 6 of them. And I don't need you to memorize all 6 of these stages. We're mainly going to focus in on a couple of important terms, and we can see that progression from simpler behaviors to more complex behaviors. But I wouldn't ask you something like, at sub-stage 6 of sensory motor stage, what are children capable of doing? Not my style of question. When we look at the very beginning, so this is right after birth. So newborns typically interact with the environment using reflexes or reflexive behaviors. And we've mentioned these before, but these are just behaviors that have some innate component to them. We have a predisposition to engage in certain repetitive, pre-programmed actions. So some of the typical ones for infants would be things like if you cover their faces with, say, a thin sheet, they actually raise their arms and push downward. So it's a reflexive behavior that's intended to keep things from blocking their airways. As they get a little bit older, we start seeing some modifications here. Primary circular reactions, or these repeated actions, are directed towards themselves. So if you've ever watched infants and they often play with sucking their thumbs, or they'll hold their toes, or they move repetitively, so maybe they kick constantly, those kinds of repeated actions that allow them to sort of experience their own bodies and manipulate themselves, those would fall under this category. So in that 1 month to 4 month range, they're mainly focused on their immediate selves. As they get a little bit older, they start focusing more outward. So then that 4 to 8 months, those are secondary circular reactions. So these are more repeated actions, but now they're on objects outside of their own bodies. So if they have a toy that's soft, they might constantly touch that toy to feel that texture. Again, when we get a little bit older, we see that object permanence cut off around the 8 month mark. We start seeing combinations of secondary circular reactions, so they can actually have sequences of fairly repetitive behaviors. Eventually they get into tertiary circular reactions, and so this is where they not only, say, touch or interact with things directly, but they see what happens if they throw this item, or if they hit something with something else. So they're looking at how external objects can interact with other objects. So you've probably encountered a toddler, or toddler, I guess, just over a year old, where they sit in their high chair and continually throw everything they can get their hands on off the edge. And maybe they want to see if it falls the same way, or maybe they like the sound that it produces. That would be one of their tertiary circular reactions. And they talk about it in terms of sort of experimenting. And you'll often see that they do similar types of behaviors under slightly different conditions. So if you give them a pot that you've turned upside down and they hit it with a wooden block, it makes one kind of sound. And then they hit it with a plastic block and it makes a different sound. They would find that fascinating and then might try and hit it with different substances to produce different sounds. So in these cases, it's all about experimentation to learn more about how stuff works in their environment. And then the last of these stages here is when we start seeing mental representation. So this is where we'd start seeing the ability to form memories and use that knowledge of past events to influence future behavior. So maybe they've learned that in the past doing this got me in trouble, so I won't do it again. There's a whole bunch of different theories when you start talking about memory and the fact that what's called infantile amnesia or childhood amnesia, people tend not to remember anything before they're about 2 or 3 years of age. And that could be part of this, where they're not forming these memories. But it can also be related to things like development in the brain. Because as we saw, our brains are still rapidly developing and changing. So as stuff moves around, we just might not be capable of storing those memories until much later on. Or maybe we stored them but couldn't actually retrieve them. There's a whole bunch of theories on what causes that infantile amnesia, but there isn't really a sort of guaranteed solution to it. Mainly, we just know that it's something that's pretty consistent across cultures, and it pretty much always ends right around this time or a little bit later on. So another topic to bring in. For our next section, that's that pre-operational stage. So second stage down from our first list. So this is that 2 to 7 years of age. And so we're finally starting to see a little bit of symbolic representation. So here we're learning that words can represent different items. So you can talk about something that isn't necessarily immediately present to you. So I can think about something that I know exists but is no longer here. And this kind of slightly abstract thinking gives us the ability to have things like pretend play. So a child could imagine something happening. Mostly their play is going to relate to things that they encounter in their everyday lives. So stuff that they have experience with or stuff that they've seen themselves. But they are starting to think symbolically because of this stage, or I guess at the start of this stage. We do not see that conservation idea yet. We mentioned that's the cutoff between this pre-operational stage and the next one, the operational stage. We'll look at that in a second. And we talked about egocentrism as that focus on the self. Animism is another term or another concept that's important here. And this is just the belief that inanimate objects have feelings. So you're kind of animating them in your own mind. So for children of this age, they'd probably think of their stuffed animals as real creatures, things that are alive. And so they might be really distressed if they can't bring their stuffed toy with them because they don't want it to be lonely, or they don't want it to feel like it's been abandoned. So they have this, again, slightly symbolic thinking, slightly abstract, but not too far beyond what they've encountered in their day-to-day lives. They'd assume that those items have feelings similar to their own feelings. So a lot of it would be, I'm worried they'd be lonely because I would be lonely if I was left alone. And for the irreversibility, it actually ties to our conservation idea. So we can hop here and actually look at what conservation is. So there's a bunch of different kinds of conservation, and children are typically going to pass all of these right around the same time. The first of these is the conservation of volume, so this top series of visuals. And so what you do in all of these cases is you start with some initial equality. So I show you that there are the same number or the same volume or the same amount of two things. So here we have 2 glasses of water and they're full to the same level. So we know that there's the same amount of water in both. What happens in the middle is a transformation. So now we're going to change something. So here, one of those short glasses of water gets poured into a taller glass. So the taller glass is narrower, meaning that when we look at it in the end, we see that the tall glass, the water level is now higher. And the initial shorter glass, it has a lower water level. But for us, all past this stage, we know that if you just dumped water from one glass to another, there's still the same volume of water there. So we would be able to say very quickly and easily that in this final stage, they both have the same quantity, they both have the same values. But for a child who's in this pre-operational stage who can't pass this conservation task, they would assume that the taller glass has more in it. And in this case, it's mainly down to how much space is being taken up. So when something looks larger, they have this assumption that there's just more of it. So that actually holds down here with our conservation of mass. And what they've done is used, say, clay, and show that the two balls are the same size, and then you squish one, and if you can't pass that conservation test, they'd say that the one that's spread out and flat has more clay because it takes up a larger area, it's larger surface. And this one is a conservation of number, where we'd have, say, a bunch of pennies, and you show that there's 5 in each line, but you stretch out one line, and if they fail, they would say that the one that takes up more space is the one that has more pennies. As sort of a little bit of an aside that you don't need to know, this might actually be related to the fact that we have 2 different systems for estimating numbers. And it's not just humans that have these 2 systems. There's a whole bunch of research into numerosity in other species that seems to have some evidence that we have multiple systems. But the way that it works is that we have sort of a rough estimation for small amounts, so small quantities. And so at a glance, we usually use shortcuts, things like how much space is it taking up? And we assume taking up more space means that there's more of something. Whereas we have a secondary number system that comes in later that gives us a much more precise estimate. So we're better able to determine quantities once we get a little bit older. So this task might actually be related to us not having that secondary number system beforehand, but developing it later on. So I kind of find it neat that this task ends up being fairly similar to a lot of the numerosity or almost counting tasks. And in case you're curious, there are tons of really neat studies that look at counting in things like spiders. I've met with Dr. Fiona Cross, and she works with jumping spiders and how they count prey items. So if it's something you're curious about, I definitely love talking about it. But yeah, sticking with just the conservation component, failing this task means you're still in that pre-operational stage, and passing it is one of those criteria you need to do in order to get into the next stage, that operational stage. So our concrete operational stage is from 7 to 12, and here we start seeing the ability to perform mathematical manipulations. So this here is where we start seeing, again, more complicated thought processes. And now these are still things that are tangible, things that they can imagine occurring, things that they've probably encountered before, and they're able to sort of imagine what would happen in order to get their answers. So this is when you start seeing kids being able to solve those problems of this person has this many oranges and that person has that many oranges, how many do they have together? Well, they've seen oranges and they've seen numbers of oranges and they have understandings of quantities now, so they can probably do the math without straining themselves too hard. So it's something that's tangible to them because they have that experience. And this is tying back to get to the next stage, they need to be able to think about things that couldn't happen or that haven't happened. So this is before they get that abstract reasoning ability. So they have a lot of trouble with abstract concepts at this point, especially stuff that they've never encountered or that they've never seen, because then they can't conceptualize of what it would be like if it did occur. So that's that thumb location question. And then, of course, our last of these childhood stages is the formal operational stage, and this starts around 11 or 12 and then moves onward until, if people make that adult stage, the 5th stage might come next, though we'll discuss that one and why it may or may not occur in some people later on. But this one is all about those abstract problems. They're still capable of the more concrete manipulations and reasonings, but abstract reasoning is our identifier here. And in this stage, we start seeing a lot of sort of I don't know what would happen, but let's see what would happen. Let's try it out. Let's conduct an experiment and see if my guess was right or wrong. So a little bit more of that scientific experimentation mentality in this stage, and it's getting into more and more abstract concepts. All right, and so then this slide here is looking at some of our critical thinking when it comes to Piaget's stage theory. And I've already given us a little bit of a heads up on some of the criticisms here. So what are some of the good parts? So the different cognitive abilities that have been sort of focused on for each of those 4 stages, they actually seem to have some consistency across different cultures and across all sorts of children. So this is something that they call sort of a universal idea or a universal occurrence, because we don't see it modified too much by cultural factors. So you'll see things like object permanence coming in before we see things like conservation of mass abilities. Those tend to occur in a predictable order. And that tells us that, yeah, these stages then might have some merit to them if they are dividing things up into things that generally occur in that set order. It's at least a useful descriptor. And we've before in other topics talked about things, if we see universality across multiple cultures, that tells us that there's probably some kind of biological or genetic component that's allowing this to occur. So we might be talking about one of those biological frameworks, once again, that allows us to develop these abilities in this particular order. We don't necessarily talk about what the mechanism is, but we say that it would exist. Some of our not so great, children tend to acquire some of these skills a lot earlier than what Piaget originally thought. So some of those timelines that we've set out, those might be sort of a late estimate. And like I said before, a lot of that comes from just how we test these things, where different types of tests end up showing us that maybe you have that ability sooner than an earlier type of test was able to detect. One of the sort of logics behind this is some tests actually rely not just on having whatever ability it is that we're looking at, sometimes they also rely on things like being able to make certain responses. So if, for example, you have a test that requires a child to reach for an object to show that they understand that it exists even if they can't see it, well, what if they don't have the motor coordination to actually reach for something in their environment? Or what if they don't know that they are able to interact with things in their environment? So reaching for an object permanence task might actually be more of an indication of, are they motorly capable of reaching, rather than do they know to reach to see a thing that's out of sight. And that's why we typically have multiple methods to test for each of those different abilities, because other things might be going on. Back to another positive here. Within each of these stages, or actually no, this one is a negative, sorry, my its wire is in an inconvenient spot. But within each of the stages, we do see some inconsistent development. So while if we take a big step back and say, yeah, overall the pattern seems to be pretty consistent and in multiple places, multiple cultures, within each stage there's a lot of movement where some kids are going to be really good at some things early on, and they might take a long time to get some things later on. That also ends up influencing over here with some of these complexities where you might have some things within one category that you can't do and things within the next category that you can do. So it's not universally working for all of the substages within each of these divisions. And that ties in, sometimes we know things earlier than what was originally predicted, sometimes we learn things a little bit later, and it's not always as clean cut as it would have been set out. And though we have said, so we have that universality for the big picture development of a lot of these abilities, we do still see some culture influences. So the ability to know that objects exist or not isn't necessarily going to change a whole heck of a lot, but the way that we learn some of this information, and especially things like standards for parenting styles and what children would be exposed to or not exposed to, depending on culture, can just influence how quickly or slowly some of these things occur. So there can be slight modifications, though the big overall pattern tends to be consistent. So these two aren't necessarily contradictive. They're just saying up close and far away, slightly different interpretations. And we had talked about this for our diagrams here. I used a different one, and this is one of those that I only keep around because people in textbooks don't know how to draw babies at all, and so they're always absolutely terrible. So this one is going into my collection of terrible figures. But this is that habituation and possible or impossible actions to see if you have object permanence. And that was that one thing where if we remove the need for that motor component, all of a sudden we see object permanence much, much sooner than we used to think it was. So yeah, we end up having an understanding of the physical world a lot sooner than might have been implied with some of Piaget's determinations. All right, and of course, whenever we talk about a theory, we always talk about somebody else who's proposed something different. So after Piaget, we have Vygotsky, who is another one of our big famous developmental psychologists. And here, Vygotsky is known for his sociocultural contributions. So Piaget was all focused on stages and sort of universal development and assuming consistency, but Vygotsky really wanted to lean into the fact that we learn and develop and change within a social environment as well. So children have siblings or parents or teachers, people who can help when they're trying to accomplish certain tasks. And so Vygotsky wasn't a huge fan of all of the sort of harsh cutoffs in between all of Piaget's stages. Instead, he really wanted to look at, is there sort of a gradual transition between what you can do versus what you can't do? And he described this as his zone of proximal development. So zone of proximal development is just saying this is a stage where you can't do a certain task by yourself, but if you had help, if you had somebody sort of guide you along or give you hints, you would be capable of performing the task. So it's not that you are completely incapable, it's that you just need a few pointers. And that gives us that in-between. So instead of Piaget's yes or no, now we have no unless. And it gets to show us that there's more to it than just yes or no. And so he focused in on scaffolding as a guided practice, specifically saying that our parents or guardians or teachers are providing a scaffold. They are providing a support system that would facilitate the children to do something a little bit beyond what they'd be capable of on their own. So you can give them cognitive support as they're trying to solve problems or as they're trying to accomplish different tasks. So this could be things like maybe you have mnemonics, so memory aid devices. So a child can't remember the order to do certain actions, but maybe you've made up a rhyme that helps them perform the steps in the right order. Or maybe you have different reminders that would encourage them to start a task or stop a task at a certain point. There's all sorts of different psychological tools that he would have described as ways that you could help facilitate that performance. Yeah, I don't want to go too much off of that. We already said, so zone of proximal development. Another way to talk about it is this is our difference between what the child can do independently versus what they can do with assistance. So this is that gray area that's missed by Piaget. And the reason why this is so important is because when our brains are developing, we don't go from nothing to everything. It isn't sort of a sudden change. Typically, we're going to see gradual development. It's going to happen over time. And so by checking what we are capable of with and without help, now we get to see that maturation process. We get to see that gradual change until finally they can perform the task independently. So just additional levels of complexity for our understanding. So we still have some limits of our biological maturation. There are still things that we are not capable of completing even with help, but this helps us figure out, okay, is it something we completely can't do, or is it something where we just have slight limitations and need a step up from parents, or is it something that we can do completely independently even without help? All of those are now possible. And that's actually a nice way to transition from just cognitive development into social development, starting to look at how we interact with others in our social environment. And there's a whole bunch of different theorists that we can mention here. Bowlby is a really important one that looked at attachment style. We'll also talk about Mary Ainsworth, and Ainsworth is the one that designed and started using the strange situation paradigm, which we'll see in a few slides. And then eventually we'll talk about Kohlberg. And Kohlberg is someone who's well known for trying to divide down moral decisions and what our morals are based on depending on sort of what stage of life that we're at. So all of those will come up in the next few slides. But if we're going to be talking about attachment styles and eventually get into, I already forgot the name, Bowlby's attachment styles, we should also start off with another important figure, which is Lorenz. And Konrad Lorenz is another one of those figures who is fairly problematic because of who he was as a person, but he's always discussed because his research was something that was built upon to get us to where we are today in some area of the field. So Lorenz was the one who's famous for working with imprinting in geese. So this is when you have geese hatch, and from a very young age, they start following around things that are present in their environment. Now, there are certain factors that are influencing what they do or don't attach to. Some of the biggest things typically are that the item in their environment should be around about a certain size. So they'd be more likely to imprint on something goose-sized than, say, car-sized. But they also need that thing to move. So that's typically how they recognize the environment versus an object that would be something to imprint upon. But once they've decided that this is the thing that I've imprinted upon, that's what they end up following. And you can actually see this in a bunch of other studies. That's something that's not just exclusive to geese. Chickens actually do this as well. And there are some interesting studies, again, tying back to our numerosity discussion, where they'll have a few days after hatching chicks, so the baby chickens, where if you have blocks with certain numbers of dots on them moving through the environment, the chicks will start following them. And showing that that concept of numerosity or numbers exists, they will follow specifically blocks that have the correct number of dots, but not an incorrect number of dots, which is kind of cool. But it does show that they imprint on things moving through their environment that aren't too large. And so with Lorenz, he was picking apart what are those features that we attach to. So there must be some biological component because it happens right away. There isn't a chance to learn that this is a thing you should follow. And it isn't exclusive to sort of one particular stimulus. So it's typically something that's present soon after hatching, something that's moving, but also something that keeps coming back. So all of that is supposed to set them up to imprint on their parents and then follow their parents. And that would be our evolutionary story, is that if you follow your parents, you're more likely to be protected and fed and things like that. But yeah, they will imprint on other things as well. Another of our important experiments at the time, you may have heard of Harlow. And Harlow did a study looking at different theories of attachment, specifically the comfort theory versus the cupboard theories of attachment. So in case you're not familiar, Harlow was trying to figure out, do offspring like their parents simply because they provide food, or do they like their parents because they find them comforting and something that's familiar and something they want to spend time with? So the argument here was, okay, if it's all about, say, classical conditioning, and I know that this thing gives me milk, therefore I'm going to spend time with it because milk is good, then we'd see that simply providing food would be sufficient to increase the amount of time you spend with whatever gives you food. So he did this with young monkeys, and what he did was he had a wire mother and a cloth mother, the wire one just being a chicken wire kind of monkey shape. Mainly it looks like a giant cone, and it had a bottle. So if the monkey wanted to go and drink milk, if it wanted food, it had to go to the wire mother. The cloth mother was covered in soft, fluffy fur, something that would be more comforting. And so if it's all about food, they'd spend time with the food-giving wire mother, and if it's all about comfort, they'd stick with the fuzzy comfort mother, even though that one didn't give them food. And he ended up supporting the comfort theory because the monkey would only go to the wire mother to get food, and then would immediately go back to the soft, fuzzy cloth mother. And that was a consistent pattern where they spent about 95% of their time with the cloth mother. So two very important historical figures for our understanding of attachment, as well as sort of what else is going on there, making sure it's not just comfort, that it's comfort and biological needs being met instead of just the biology.